Thanks so much, Taylor. Yeah, I'm super excited too. I get so many questions about Azure Synapse and what is it and what does it do, and I'm kind of confused, and so I'm looking forward to kind of demystifying the platform today and talk about my experiences with it. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in. So first of all, let's just start with I'm going to kind of build a diagram here that kind of explains all the different pieces of Azure Synapse. And so we'll be able to talk about that. But essentially, Azure Synapse Analytics is a suite of powerful data services that can all be managed inside of Azure Synapse Studio. Azure Synapse Studio is a workspace. It used to be called Azure Synapse Workspace. Now it's called Azure Synapse Studio, but it allows you to create these different data services from within the studio and kind of manage them all together in one place. Now, where a lot of the confusion comes in is this involves a lot of different data services from throughout Azure, but all of these different services sometimes get referred to as Azure Synapse, even though they are their own standalone services as well. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So what are the different pieces? First of all, there's the ingest and transform pieces that exist inside Synapse. So there's Synapse pipelines. There's also Synapse data flows, which use Spark to do data transformations using a low-code, no-code UI. So this is identical to Azure Data Factory. In fact, this is Azure Data Factory. What they've done is they've ported Azure Data Factory into Azure Synapse Studio, and they've renamed it to Synapse Pipelines. Not really too surprising there. They're using the same icons, the same logos. If you look in and see what kind of actions are available in the Synapse Pipelines, all the same actions that are available in Azure Data Factory. There's a comparison on the web that you can go and look at and see what the difference is. And as it turns out, Azure Synapse Pipelines can do everything that Azure Data Factory can do. Azure Data Factory, in fact, can do quite a bit more. It can interact with a few more services. It has a few more abilities and capabilities out there. So there's nothing that you can do in Synapse Pipelines that you can't do in Azure Data Factory, but you can do a little bit more in Azure Data Factory. Okay, now there's the storage part of Azure Synapse, right? For storage in Azure Synapse, that base storage, the ingestion layer, is Azure Data Lake Gen 2. Again, this is its own standalone service outside of Azure Synapse that you can create and that you can use for storage. We're using this, of course, for storage in TimeXtender as well, right? Bringing data, landing that in the ODX, and placing that, storing that in Parquet files. You can, of course, do that here within Azure Synapse as well. Use Azure Synapse Pipelines, pull the data in, land that in a data lake. There's also what's called the Dedicated SQL Pool. Now, this is a rebrand of what was Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Oftentimes, when you hear people refer to Azure Synapse as a database, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the Dedicated SQL Pool. This is the massively parallel processing architecture that's available in Azure Synapse. We'll be talking a lot more about this Dedicated SQL Pools in this session, because this is the part of Azure Synapse that TimeXtender supports and that we can help enable and help customers use. There's also now the query and compute areas of Azure Synapse. So as part of this, there's what's called the serverless SQL pool, or it's basically a query engine, right? It's serverless. You can use it to query data in the data lake, query data in the dedicated SQL pool, but you don't need a dedicated server to use this query engine. You can just use it, and it just spins up as you execute queries. It charges you for the compute. It doesn't charge you for storage. There's no storage available in it. It's very inexpensive, and it's a fantastic service to use for querying data directly in the data lake. We'll actually be talking a lot about this in our next session in 2 weeks, how to query data in the data lake. we'll use this and we'll show you how to use this part of Synapse. There's also the Spark query engine. So if you are more familiar with Spark and you want to use that to query and manipulate data, you can do that using a serverless query engine available in Synapse. There's also now the analysis side of Azure Synapse. And when you're talking with folks from Microsoft and they say, well, I really need some machine learning, does Synapse help with that? Absolutely, it helps with that. And that's because, again, these services are available throughout Azure, and you can incorporate these external platforms into the Azure Synapse Studio workspace and the area. And so you can kind of use these as all just one big piece by using areas of Azure Machine Learning and also bringing in Power BI workspaces into the Azure Synapse Studio. Again, you can use the full power of these platforms in just another browser tab, or you can use them within Azure Synapse Studio. A lot of the confusion comes in, again, where all of these services may be referred to Azure Synapse. If you're talking to folks from Microsoft on the commercial team and you mention, any one of these, they're like, oh yeah, Synapse, Synapse does that, Synapse does that. And that's because, well, again, Synapse it's a collection of powerful data services all brought together for data warehousing. Awesome.
So, Joseph, I see quite a lot here. Is it true that you may use just certain blocks, not all of them, and still be considered using fully Synapse?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, most implementations of Synapse aren't going to use every one of these. They're just going to use maybe a Synapse pipeline and a data lake and a SQL query engine. You could just use all of that. You could build a full Synapse implementation without even having a dedicated SQL pool if you wanted to. So yeah, great question. All right, moving right along. And the one thing I did want to mention here, these two pieces here, the query and compute pieces, are really the only exclusive pieces to Azure Synapse. As you'll see, I'll do today in the demo, I'll go ahead and create a dedicated SQL pool outside of Azure Synapse. So we'll create that as part of our SQL Server in Azure that we already have. So these two areas here are the only exclusive Synapse features. All right. So what we're going to be building today, or at least we're going to be migrating to, is the TimeXtender reference architecture for Azure Synapse. As you'll notice, if you have been following along with the previous sessions, you'll notice a lot of similarities here, right? TimeXtender is, building and ingesting data into that data lake using Azure Data Factory. Again, all parts that, Azure Synapse does as well. We're going to be using the Synapse SQL Pool, or the dedicated SQL Pool. Instead of using Data Factory to move the data from the lake to the pool, we're going to be using Polybase to do that. And that's because that is the recommended transport method when using the dedicated SQL pools, recommended from Microsoft. We're going to be using our existing framework, existing architecture here, so you'll see all these different pieces involved as well. But you'll notice the only difference between this architecture and the Azure SQL Database architecture is the dedicated SQL pool. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be creating that pool and then replacing that in our TimeXtender instance in Azure. Okay, moving right along. So the question is, if the only difference is Azure SQL Database and dedicated SQL Pool, why would I want to use a dedicated SQL Pool? What are the benefits? What are what would cause me to need a Synapse or a dedicated SQL Pool? Well, the main area is size, data size. And that really comes to about 1 terabyte of data size. If you have over 1 terabyte of data inside of your data warehouse, that's when you want to start considering Azure Synapse Analytics. This is really where the power and the strength of having this larger, more expensive platform comes in, when you have a lot more data. Also, when you have billion row tables, you need at least 100 million rows in a table in order to start seeing the performance gains of the column store indexes that are done in Azure Synapse Analytics. So you really need some very massive, large fact tables in your data warehouse to start seeing and experiencing these gains. Otherwise, you might actually have queries that are quite a bit slower than Azure SQL Database. You also need fewer than 128 concurrent queries. If you have a lot more than that, that many users concurrently querying the database, they will get set into a queue and they will essentially have to wait in line outside while everybody else is getting their data until they can come in. And, of course, Synapse handles all of that natively, but there is a limitation to how many simultaneous queries can be handled by Azure Synapse. Also, a lot of performance tuning skills and resources are required. We'll see this as I get into the next slide here, but there's a lot of complexity on how to manage the database and how to manage these resource classes and indexes and distributions. And so we'll see that in just a second. So if you have less than a terabyte, if you have fewer than multi-100 million row tables, you really should consider staying on Azure SQL Database. If you're seeing very significant performance degradation because your data is starting to grow, well, then definitely talk to your partner, talk to your solution specialist, and let's consider if Azure Synapse is going to be right for you, or a dedicated SQL pool. And it's also, Azure SQL Database is dramatically less expensive to run. I would say it's anywhere from 3 to 10 times less expensive. Once you switch to a dedicated SQL pool, you will see, more expensive. Of course, you'll see why in just a second. Okay, so Azure Synapse Dedicated SQL Pool is a massively parallel processing architecture. And this is because the compute nodes are actually split up and can scale out rather than scaling up. If you think of a traditional SQL server, this is installed on a single machine, and in order to make that SQL server faster, you have to scale up that machine, right? You have to add processing power, you have to add RAM, you have to add hard drives to that single machine. Now, the way that this architecture works, you can scale out, you can add additional what we call nodes, which are smaller, essentially machines, separate machines that have their own computing power that can work together as a single entity, and you communicate through to them through the control node. So let's talk about that. So we have these various compute nodes, and this, of course, is why Azure Synapse, or the dedicated SQL pools, is significantly more expensive. So there is some complex architecture here. Another thing to note that's very important is in Azure Storage at the very bottom here, the tables, the data in dedicated SQL pools is distributed across 60 distributions. Okay, and so the tables that are in Azure Storage are always distributed across 60 distributions. And this is why querying the data, a smaller table, may actually be faster in a normal SQL database than it is in Azure Synapse. Because of that distribution across all of these different areas, it actually takes a little bit longer to get to that data. And so when you have massive amounts of data, all these multiple workers can work together to serve it up. But if you really don't have, if you have less than 100 million rows, having that all in just a single area and a single instance of SQL is going to be a little bit faster. All right, so when you have these distributions, you have to split up your tables, and that can be done in a number of different ways. Now, really, I'm just showing you this. I'm going to stay at a very high level today because we can't go into too much detail. We don't have that much time. But I really wanted to just illustrate the kind of the complexity when working with Azure Synapse. These are things that you have to consider for each and every table you have in your data warehouse. How are you going to distribute these tables? How are you going to move this data across? And that can be done, as I mentioned here, a number of different ways. So it's just something that you want to think about and consider. Right. There's also resource classes. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but users that are querying Azure Synapse or doing stored procedures in Azure Synapse are assigned to a resource class, and that can define the amount of concurrency, how many different processes that they can run simultaneously, as well as how much memory is allocated to a single process. So of course, the larger ones have more available memory, but a much lower concurrency, while the smaller ones have lower memory, but can run at a higher concurrency. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will jump right into our session today. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take our existing deployment of TimeXtender, where I've built the solution in Azure, and I'm going to switch over from an Azure SQL database to a Synapse dedicated SQL pool. So we'll show you how that's done today. Now, if you are going to follow along, you do need a few things ready to go. You need access to the Azure portal with permissions to create resources. You do need a TimeXtender app server and ODX storage configured, which we have running today. You also need a data lake ODX storage configured. Now, in order to deploy on Synapse, you do need, that is a prerequisite in TimeXtender, you need the ODX storage with that storage being a data lake Gen 2. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump right in. The first step here is to create a dedicated SQL pool. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now, as I mentioned today, we're not going to do this as part of Synapse. We can go in, we can create this as part of our Synapse Studio, of course. In this case, what I'm going to do is I already have this existing resource here, this SQL Server that I've been using in Azure as Azure SQL Server. I have a few databases. We can see my MDW database, my different repositories that I have available. But what I'm going to do is, you see this button up here, you can see it just says create a new dedicated SQL pool. So I'm going to do that right here. We're going to create this new dedicated SQL pool. So as I mentioned, we can do this in Synapse, in a Synapse Studio. But as you can see here, I'm creating a dedicated SQL pool, and there's really no mention of Synapse, right? This is a standalone product, the dedicated SQL pool, at least according to what we can see here in the Azure portal. I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call this TX SQL Pool MDW. All right, and we can select the performance level. Now, the performance level defines how many of those compute nodes that we have reserved for our instance. If we do 500, this is just going to be one compute node. Anything less than that is actually only going to be a fraction of a single compute node. I'm just going to do DW300C for right now, and then we can scale it down or scale it up later on. But as we can see here, this is going to be 22 Danish kronas per hour. I think that's about $5 per hour. So as you can see, $5 per hour, that can get pretty pricey if you're running this 24 hours a day for a month. That can get fairly expensive. So I'm going to hit apply, and we're going to go through here. No special network settings. I'm not going to do, just default pretty much all the way through. Review and create. Let's go ahead and create that. And this is going to create that dedicated SQL pool in the existing server, or Azure SQL Server, that I already have. So I have my Azure SQL Server. I just created a dedicated SQL pool. So now that I know the name of my dedicated SQL pool, I also have the name of my server already. We can go into TimeXtender and we can start creating that global database. Sorry, that was my local TimeXtender instance. Here is the VM in Azure that we've been using throughout, right? The TimeXtender Tuesdays project. We have an existing ODX with a data lake. We have a data warehouse here available. Let's open up our global databases, and we'll create a new global database. I'm going to call this the Synapse SQL Pool. Okay, this is a data warehouse. We'll create that, and we'll go to settings, and we get to define the server name. So let me just copy this from what I have over here. This is the Azure server name that I've been using. Again, we called that database TX SQL Pool MDW. Okay, collation is default. We are going to be using SQL Server authentication here. We haven't yet defined my username, but I actually do have some scripts already ready with the username and passwords that I'm going to define. So I'm just going to copy these over and paste them right in. And we'll talk about, these are the how you create users in Synapse, and we'll go through those steps as well. So I'm just copying these in so I can create this global database. And the final very important thing, you put your server name, database name, login information. And when doing Synapse, very important, you have to go down to the deployment target, and you have to set this as SQL Data Warehouse, right? Of course, this is what's going to change all of these stored procedures and enable some of the additional features that are only available on the dedicated SQL pools. We're not going to mess with Azure Data Factory here, again, because that's by default going to be using Polybase, which is built into the dedicated SQL pool. All right. So we'll go ahead and leave this. We can test the connection in a minute. Looks like our deployment is complete. So our resource is created. We have that available. Let's now use SQL Server Management Studio to go in. We're going to connect to the server. We're going to create our logins. We're going to assign, we're going to create our logins. We're going to assign the users to a resource class, and we're going to create a master key. These are 3 important steps when building in Synapse. So the first step is to create the SQL Server login. So I am already connected to this Azure SQL Server, as you'll see here. I'm going to right click here and refresh the databases. Now, as you notice, we had those 3 databases that were already there as part of our TX Tuesdays, if you've been following along. And you'll see this new SQL pool that I just created, TX SQL Pool MDW. All right, so the first thing that I need to do in here is I need to create a new login in the master database. So I'm pointing to the master database. I'm going to go ahead and run this script right here, create login with password, okay? Okay, so I just created the login with a password in the master database. Now what I want to do is I want to switch over to my SQL pool, and I want to create a user in that SQL pool using that login. All right, so create user TX Tuesdays from login TX Tuesdays. Hit execute, and that creates the user in the SQL pool. The next thing is I need to assign that user to a role. All right, so we have here the database roles. I'm going to go ahead and execute that. So I'm assigning TX Tuesdays as DB owner. And finally, we need to assign TX Tuesdays to a resource class. So I'm doing that here, hitting execute. And again, finally, we do need a master key. This is important. This is how Azure Synapse encrypts and saves all of the keys that it needs to access the data in my data lake. Of course, my data lake is secured, but I'm going to be transferring data from my lake into Synapse. All right, so this master key is what's used to kind of encrypt and store the credentials to access my data lake. Now we've got all that done. So our data lake or our Synapse SQL pool is now set up. Let's go back to TimeXtender. Let's test the connection. Okay, I'm connected. My credentials are working. Click OK. And that'll save that global database. All I need to do now is go into the data warehouse, edit the data warehouse, and change my global database over to the Synapse SQL pool. I'll go ahead and click OK. And then I can simply deploy and execute. This is going to create the Polybase scripts. Oh, one step that I did miss here, apologize about that, is I need to create the required objects for SQL Data Warehouse. So this goes in and this creates the external connection to my Azure Data Lake, right? It knows where my Azure Data Lake is. So it's creating that external connection, that external data source to the data lake. Now I can deploy and execute. So this is going to go through, it's going to start creating all of those tables in my Synapse SQL pool and go through the process of using Polybase to ingest that data from my data lake into the dedicated SQL pool. And another thing, the nice thing about this is it's using the code that's important to the dedicated SQL pool. You can't just write the same stored procedures that you would in SQL Server. It's a very different technology, very different language. How you interact, sorry, it's the same language, it's still T-SQL, but how you interact, how you write these create table statements are very different in a dedicated SQL pool. So we have a few minutes left. I did want to open it up for any questions. Taylor, how's it going out there? Do we have any questions?
Great. Yeah, we just have one question coming in. Joseph, what would be our means to confirm that the SQL pool was created in Synapse versus the standard SQL server?
Yeah, great question. So again, Synapse is a studio. It's an area that you can collect external resources. So I can go into a Synapse Studio. I actually have one available. JT, let's see if I can find this. Let's just open my JT demo here, and I can go into my Synapse workspace, which I have. Let me open Synapse Studio. And then once I'm in Synapse Studio, I can incorporate that existing dedicated SQL pool into my studio, right? So again, Synapse isn't anything particularly special because I created that dedicated SQL pool outside of Synapse. And now I go in here to data. I have my databases. This is going to connect to my data lake that I have connected. And now I can link my dedicated SQL pool, right? I can link a SQL database. I can link an external data set, right? So we can go in here. So I have my data lake, my storage already linked. And if I go in the workspace, I can go in here and I can connect to that dedicated SQL pool that's available. I hope that answers your question there. Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody.